And he seems to me to have gone all lefty. I know that's a weird thing to say about Nigel Farage, but he seems to be adopting quite a lot of the policies that Jeremy Corbyn had, some of which were, it had to be said, quite popular.
So Reform UK have been rising in the polls for the last 6 months or so. They're really on a charge in terms of their overall popularity, especially since the local election results where they absolutely decimated Conservatives across many councils in the north of England. And because of this, they're getting a bit more scrutiny in terms of the policy platform that they're looking to implement. And at a time when there is very little trust in neoliberalism, when people have seen the failures of Conservative governance, despite the fact that Nigel Farage himself has always kind of been a Thatcherite, I think he kind of knows that he can't really sell this to the public. And at a time when Labour are kind of failing a lot of their core voter base, who have moved away from the party, have moved in the polling to don't know, Reform haven't won many of them over though. When you look at the actual crosstabs and a lot of polls, most Labour voters from 2024 are more likely to look towards the Green Party and Liberal Democrats than they are towards Reform. And Nigel Farage doesn't want to miss out on this potential sector of the electorate, and did a speech today highlighting why he thinks that working people should be voting for Reform UK and that he personally is the voice of working people. Let's have a listen and see what he has to say.
We built this party around three key principles. Things that we think need to be fought for and defended. Things that we think most people in this country hold the dearest in their hearts. And that is, of course, family, community and country. And that is why we believe lifting the two-child cap is the right thing to do. Not because we support a benefits culture, but because we believe for lower paid workers, this actually makes having children just a little bit easier for them. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve all of those problems, but it helps them. And some will tell you, well, Nigel, this is not actually a popular policy in the country. But then I've never, ever spent my time being a populist politician. I've nearly always spent my career pushing arguments that were minority opinions and trying to make them into majority opinions.
Although that's not what populist means. Populism is a rhetorical strategy whereby you pit the people versus the elite. What he is confusing and conflating here is populism with popularism, right? Popularism is where you stand on policies that you think are popular in the median opinion to try and hit a broad base of voting cohorts, right? That's popularism. Populism is when you stand rhetorically with the people versus the elite. And he's a populist because he frames against the Westminster elite versus the people who've been failed by Westminster, right? A rhetorical strategy that's been very effective at a time when Westminster has failed. I'm a populist myself, but as a Marxist, my populism is the people versus the elite, i.e. the proletariat versus the bourgeois. But that's the same kind of rhetorical framing, you know? But what he isn't is right. He's not a popularist. He is somebody who tries to make minority opinions into majority opinions. He doesn't triangulate. He is sincere and honest about his positions. I just think his positions suck. But it's interesting, of course, that he's talking about the two-child benefit cap within the framing of wanting to incentivize people to have families and have kids. We have a demographic crisis at the moment. We had a low birth rate. We have too many old people in comparison to the number of working people with a pretty bloated pension bill because of it. So it's not unreasonable, specifically, to want to have policies that do increase the birth rate, okay? I want that to be pointing out that that's a policy that anyone would do if they wanted to fix the demographic crisis in this country.
I think we've lost our sense of focus of just how important family is. And I want to emphasise that this is aimed at British families. It's not aimed at those that come into the country and suddenly decide to have a lot of children.
Okay, so it's all about the white babies then, is it? Now, that's not necessarily what he means. If they're already British citizens, they can be of any colour, right? But it is, of course, very telling. The demographic crisis they care about is the British one and not anyone else's.
And it's the right thing to do. Now, we need to go much further. We need to go much, much further. Because one of the problems is a lot of people who want to go back to work, and it's normally women. It's men in some cases, but it's normally women. There are other huge issues around childcare. Big questions that have been raised with me. Why in our big workplaces are there not creches when there are in many other continental countries? So we want to go much, much further to encourage people to have children, to make it easier for them to have children.
I mean, and these are, again, not unreasonable policies to try and get business to accommodate people who have kids, because we're in a world where both parents have to work to afford to live. Now, of course, if we had high enough wages that only one person needed to work to afford to live, or we had housing cheap enough, like lots of council housing, for example, maybe we'd be able to go back to this previous world where people could make the choice to be somebody who was there to raise children rather than be a breadwinner of any gender, of course, but that's not the world we live in, and having provisions there is fine if we want to incentivize people to have kids. It's just, again, it's the kind of people that he wants to have kids that's the issue here, but not an unreasonable policy if you want to increase your birth rate. Although what I do find funny is that whenever a right-winger says, look at this country and the European continent, they do something good, everyone's like, oh, that's very interesting, thank you. And whenever a left-winger says, look at this country on the continent, they have a better policy now. So you go, oh, so you hate Britain then? Talking Britain down, comparing us to Denmark? I'm like, why is it always one rule for right-wingers and one rule for everybody else?
And that is why I also believe that having a transferable tax allowance between married people is the right thing to do. Now, I know many will say, look, marriage is outdated. Most people don't bother to get married anymore. And, you know, I'm hardly standing here in front of you as a religious priest and moralising. I'm not sure my own track record is ever so good on this. And we all lead imperfect lives. But what is true, what is absolutely true, and the evidence is there to prove it, is that where people who are married stay together for the longest period of time, the children that grow up in those environments have the best chance of success in life.
I mean, yeah, turns out if you have two working parents rather than one working parent, you have a better standard of living. Like, I'm not saying that the stability of a family arrangement isn't a good thing, because it's fine, whatever, but there are plenty of people who come from backgrounds where they have multiple parents who work but are not necessarily married. That doesn't necessarily lead to a lower quality of life or lower chance of success, right?
Doesn't mean you can't survive outside of those circumstances. Of course you can. But I do think having this transferable tax allowance, perhaps making marriage something that is just a little bit more important in terms of the family, I do believe that it is the right thing to do. And of course, our biggest aspiration is that working people should not start to pay tax until they earn £20,000 a year. It's a policy that is wildly popular. It is a policy that would encourage people to get off benefits and to go back to work.
The thing is, you don't even pay that much tax in the below 20,000 income bracket. And the thing about this policy that's such huge snake oil is that it sounds like it's a tax cut that you only give to poor people, but it's a tax cut that everyone who pays PAYE gets, right? Everyone gets this tax cut, regardless of their income. So what that means is you have to appreciably cut a certain level of government expenditure on public services to be able to have the fiscal room for such a tax cut. And the poorer people, who are going to be the beneficiaries in a percentage terms more than everybody else from this tax cut, are people who use more in public services than the amount they pay in tax currently. So the cuts you have to make to public spending, not only to afford cutting this tax for all of the poorer people, is also what you have to save to cut it for everybody else as well. And the people you're cutting for at the top don't use the public services as much, right? So actually, even though those people are paying less tax at the bottom, they're all going to get less in terms of public service provision. And the differential in how much less public service provision they're getting is greater than the smaller amount of tax that they're paying, right? It's a false economy that sounds good on paper, but doesn't work out in the real world. Especially when, of course, as has been pointed out in chat, Nigel Farage wants people to have health insurance. Like, if you really wanted people to be incentivized to go into work, to be incentivized to get a good job, if it was to make those jobs pay well in the first place, so you don't have to give people tax cuts for them to be able to afford to live. If they had better wages, stronger collective bargaining rights, more stock options in the company, more employee ownership, a shorter working week. These are all things that would make working easier, but that would hit the bottom line of the bourgeois, the people who pay this guy's bills. right? If you made business owners pay their workers higher wages so that they could afford to live, you wouldn't need to give these tax cuts away, and you'd still have good public services. But that would unfortunately inconvenience the Donors to Reform UK.
We also recognise those that have worked during their lives, saved for a private pension, are now penalised by the withdrawal of the winter fuel allowance. If you don't have any savings, you'll still get the winter fuel allowance. So we're punishing working people at all stages of their life, and we would reverse, absolutely reverse what has happened, and we're taking away of the winter fuel allowance. Now, of course,
and again, it's very cheap to do, so there's no reason not to.
You will all be lined up in your droves to say to me, how on earth can you afford all of this? How on earth can you afford 5 billion here or 5 billion there? Almost forgetting that the national debt is now 2.8 trillion, and that not just the last government, but this one too, are hopelessly adrift when it comes to government borrowing. We are going to make big savings. We will stand here before you in 1 year's time and show you the excessive costs that we've taken out of local government. And at a national level, if we win the next election, we will scrap net zero, something that is costing the Exchequer an extraordinary 40 billion plus pounds every year.
Okay, let's just do a quick fact check. I wonder if Google AI can give me a good figure on this. How much does the UK government spend on net zero? So we're spending 350 billion until 2050. So 25. So we're spending 14 billion a year, actually. But according to the Institute for Government, the UK would need to invest around 50 billion a year for transport, renewable and buildings. The Climate Change Committee says 0.2% of UK GDP per year. So there's different figures. But I still don't think that's going to free up the fiscal space for the £70 billion tax cut for just raising the tax-free threshold for income tax. It would be 70 billion. So we're not even near that, even with the higher estimates from the Institute for Government, for what would need to happen, not what was currently planned by the government. And even then, they're also offering inheritance tax cuts, corporation tax cuts, and they're going to probably reinstate agricultural property relief. And it's also going to be funny when in a year's time, he doesn't actually have any plan for saving money in local government because there's no money to save because they spend all their money on adult social care and on temporary accommodation.
There will be no more asylum hotels or houses of multiple occupancy. People who come here illegally across the channel or on the back of lorries will not be allowed to stay. We will scrap the DEI agenda, which is costing the taxpayer up to £7 billion a year.
So nothing. So like a tiny amount in terms of overall government spending, right? Like that wouldn't even cover his marital tax break.
Throughout the public sector. And yes, we see considerable savings to be made amongst the quangos. So yes, I do accept that these proposals, especially the one.
And again, all he's basically saying here is we can afford to do spending by cutting elsewhere and giving ridiculous figures as to how those cuts work out, you know. Of course, it's all just complete nonsense.
Lifting to £20,000, the level at which people start paying tax. I accept that it's expensive, but I genuinely believe that we can pay for it because we're not ideologically tied to the same ideas upon which we believe the Conservative and Labour governments have gone.
I mean, you're essentially in line with Liz Truss, just cut taxes and increase spending and hope it all works out. Basically, where he's coming from is just Liz Truss. Anyway, the important thing that we heard there, the things that the Labour Party has been torn apart over internally over the last couple of years is this question of the two-child benefit cap, right? In that it polls well. It is ironically quite popular. When you ask people just on the surface, do they support it? When you explain it, people tend to be less supportive of it over time. Either way, it's broadly popular just on a kind of headline polling level. And it causes huge amounts of child poverty. Hundreds of thousands of kids it pushes into poverty. It makes having kids harder, although it hasn't necessarily led to a disfertility effect. And on top of this, it makes kids less well off. More of them in poverty means more spending elsewhere to cover up the negative externalities that causes, right? It's a bad policy. The more socially conscious Labour MPs and members of the cabinet are trying to push against the popularist ideology of Morgan McSweeney and wanting to keep the cap. And given that Labour's key supporters that Reform UK are not winning over at the moment are big supporters of the welfare state, Nigel Farage is essentially trying to pander by supporting these welfare changes. And obviously with the winter fuel allowance as well, the Labour original sin that they did last year. And on top of this, there are some other policies that are kind of Labour coded that was in their contract with the people that they put out before the election, which is essentially their only policy document at this time, which was having infrastructure spending and utility spending, which is owned 50% by the state and 50% by UK pension funds. Whether or not that promise will stay by the next election remains to be seen, but they've always talked before about wanting more state ownership of utilities for national interest reasons, right? These policies are perceived by the public as being left-wing. Increased welfare spending, more public ownership. Richard Tice called for the nationalisation of Thames Water quite recently, right? So they're veering closer towards something that is not quite as right-wing as the neoliberal establishment have been for quite a long time, and where Nigel Farage's heart is, broadly. Nigel Farage is a Thatcherite. He believes in privatisation, supported Liz Truss's budget, and was a big supporter of Thatcher as well, outside of her kind of Europhilic tendencies that he disagreed with. And this is being done tactically to try and, ironically, triangulate voters. He said in his speech that he's not a popularist. He doesn't support policies because he thinks they're popular. He tries to move the dial by having unpopular policies become popular. But when it comes to these economic policies, it's the opposite. He's only saying this to triangulate voter bases. He's doing this to triangulate what he perceives to be people he can win over from people who Labour are perceived to have abandoned, right? This has led to a lot of people in the media describing Nigel Farage as turning to the left. Ian Dale said that he's now got policies similar to Jeremy Corbyn, which is strange, given that we've not really seen a broad discussion of what their infrastructure policy might look like, and that was 50% state-owned and 50% pension fund-owned, and that's for new infrastructure, I believe, or new utilities, rather than just a broad nationalisation, which is being promised by Jeremy Corbyn, right? And on top of this, they're also doing tax cuts and spending cuts, which isn't necessarily Corbynite policy at all anyway, and not even looking at things such as inclusive ownership or anything like that. And he also wants tax cuts for corporations, whereas Jeremy Corbyn was increasing tax on high earners, for example, and would want to put up corporation tax as well. So it's not really that he's being left-wing. I want to engage with these arguments in response to a Spectator article which literally described Reform UK as being a left-wing party. Let's have a read. Reform is now a left-wing party. It's written by Ross Clark, who I've never heard of before, but he looks very much like the kind of person who you'd expect to write for The Spectator. How much longer are Reform's critics going to be able to get away with calling it a right-wing party? It is not the kind of right-wing party that proposes to reinstate welfare benefits that even Labour has decided are too expensive, that pledges to nationalise the steel industry and 50% of utilities, and whose manifesto for the last election budgeted £141 billion of spending increases over 5 years, including an extra £17 billion for the NHS. Now, that's over 5 years. It's not a huge amount of spending increases, but it's certainly a pretty sizable increase compared to what was happening under the Conservative Party outside of the pandemic period, right? But I think it's worth framing something like the welfare state in terms of what is actually left or right coded internationally, rather than in the UK, where our Overton window has shifted way to the right in the last 45 years of neoliberalism. If you looked at any kind of Conservative party on the continent, none of them are so gung-ho about privatisation, as desperate to slash the welfare state as the Conservatives in this country are. It would not be seen as a good policy that a Conservative party would enact to take money away from families. It is a Conservative position to support family creation, as Nigel Farage pointed out in his speech. So to say that we want to make it harder for people to have families, no Conservative on the continent would countenance that kind of argument. That's a very specific neoliberal Thatcherite viewpoint that is characteristic of the modern Conservative Party. But even then, when they talk about welfare elsewhere, the Reform UK line on PIP was they wanted to take away more money from PIP, right? It was just a two-card It was just the two-child benefit cap that they actually wanted to reinstate because they wanted to incentivize family creation. When actually, when it comes to the rest of the welfare state, they want to cut it. They wanted to cut double the amount of welfare for the disabled because they're perceived to be scroungers than what Labour cut. So Lee Anderson was on BBC Politics Live the other day, was asked specifically about this, and he even said, no, we want to get these people into work and cutting benefits is fine, and didn't understand that PIP is not an out-of-work benefit. It's for disabled people to match their living standards regardless of their work status.
Has said he wants to cut working age benefits. Do you agree with that? Cutting working age benefits, including personal independence payments?
Given the right financial support and the right tax breaks or whatever for employees, we can get these people back place and contribute towards.
Right. So you support the government's policy.
Additional support.
Yeah, but hang on. But what's it? Yeah, but when you look at your constituency, the figures from the Department of Work and Pensions show 10,500 people in Ashfield receiving PIP as of October last year, up 89% since 2019. But you support cutting those benefits.
This is a culture. When the mines closed, when the factories closed, a lot of people went on to disability benefit. They were actually encouraged by the Thatcher.
So you're going to tell them when they come to your constituency, Lee, you're going to cut my benefits.
What I say to them,
so it's actually nothing to do with being left-wing, and welfare policy does not a left-wing party make. Most conservative parties on the continent would not have privatised literally every single utility. Now, I'm going to say that I think that it's definitely left-wing to want to nationalise lots of utilities, right? Even if it's only at 50%, I think that's a left-wing policy. But it's only one left-wing policy, really, out of the whole Reform UK prospectus of slash and burn austerity and tax cuts and loads of social conservatism, as well as a lot of right-wing economic policy. They want to do tax cuts for businesses. They have nothing to boost wages. They have nothing to boost workers' rights. In fact, they voted against workers' rights in Parliament. So actually, it's nothing to do with being left-wing outside of really this nationalisation policy, which I do not expect them to be carrying forward to the next election, because Nigel Farage didn't mention it in his speech. I also think it's worth pointing out, right, that traditionally the radical right parties in Europe have had syncretic politics. They have had very right-wing cultural policies and kind of centrist economics trying to bridge the gap between left and right to ensure that they can push their cultural message to as many people as possible in a time of economic hardship and cultural and economic decline, whilst also making sure that they don't ruffle too many feathers by pushing away people on economic policy. They do try and bridge the gap between the left and the right over economic policy. So if you look, for example, at some of the most successful radical right parties in Europe, the Sweden Democrats and Rassemblement National, they both support the welfare state, they both support state spending. You look at Fidesz in Hungary, who spend loads of money trying to incentivize family creation. You know, these are not austerity parties, these are not neoliberal parties, right? They're radical right in terms of their cultural politics, their geopolitics, how they view things like immigration and race and all of those other kind of social policies. When it comes to the brass tacks of the economy, whilst they both want to do tax cuts, broadly, they do oppose the austerity politics of the neoliberals. Like Marine Le Pen openly called for Emmanuel Macron to not increase the pension age, for example. Like, the biggest kind of cohorts of people who opposed were from the left and the right. Like Rassemblement National and the Nouveau Front Populaire, they all voted against the increase of the pension age in France, right? There are some radical right parties who are far more right-wing on the economy, like the AfD are the biggest party like that, but broadly, you see a lot of welfarism from the radical right parties across Europe because they're essentially the consequence of a failed neoliberal economic model. So they can't seem to be running on the same economic platform that failed people in the first place. It's often called welfare chauvinism because it's nativist welfarism, exactly, right? And again, it's deliberately trying to distinguish between the justified welfare recipients and the unjustified welfare recipients, right? Native population, absolutely justified in receiving welfare. If you're from the out-group, i.e. you're not from the national grouping, then you're unworthy of welfare payments, right? If you are somebody who has a difficult job where you can't afford the bills even after you have your paycheck, you're a justified recipient of welfare under that model. And when it comes to the disabled, the useless eaters, those people need to have their welfare cut, as Lee Anderson was pointing out on BBC Politics Live. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.